Welcome to Impact, the Conversation, a podcast of the University of Minnesota's Institute on Community Integration that brings you strategies and stories advancing the inclusion of people with disabilities. Our guests are the authors of Impact, our long-running magazine that bridges the research to practice gap with professional and personal reflections on what matters most in disability equity today. I'm your host, Janet Stewart.
Hi, I'm Leigh Ann McKingsley. I work for the ARC's National Center on Criminal Justice and Disability, and the center has been around for 10 years now, focused on addressing the issues that people with intellectual and developmental disabilities are facing when it comes to their involvement in the criminal justice system.
I'm just really excited for today's episode because you have really spent your entire career in the disability justice field, and it's just really exciting to have you here today. So just to kind of get started, your article for the justice issue goes into how the National Center got started, but can you briefly talk about its history and how you came to be part of it all?
Absolutely, and thank you for that question, because I like hearing histories of how things got started and the why behind it. And I actually came to the ARC when I was 24 because the ADA had passed 4 years earlier. And the ADA, of course, was looking at how do we make sure that people with disabilities have accommodations when it comes to criminal justice issues. Under Title II of the ADA, it specifically looks at state and local governments and are they providing accommodations? Well, the ARC was looking to educate folks about that very issue. And so they received a grant through the Department of Justice to create materials for law enforcement, attorneys, people with intellectual developmental disabilities about this topic. And I applied for that and was hired to do that work and immediately realized how little people knew about this population and about this intersection. And I had learned of the work of Bob Persky, who some of your listeners may know because of his history in the field of writing books about the topic of people who were executed, facing death row, who had intellectual developmental disabilities. And he was really my mentor at the very beginning and throughout. And so that set the stage for really wanting to explore this work, provide advocacy, working with our state and local chapters, and how we could do that effectively. And then it was only 10 years ago that we were able to get funding through the Department of Justice to create the National Center on Criminal Justice and Disability housed within the ARC. So that was really a dream kind of come true, that finally we could get enough funding and support to look at this issue very specifically. Typically, the funding doesn't come that way. There hasn't been a lot of funding in this area. So we're so grateful just for the opportunity to focus in on this. And so it's been a long journey going in that direction.
I really wanted to ask you about that because, how maddening was it, as someone who's passionate about the law, about disability advocacy, we have these laws on the books for a reason, and it just takes so long to get practical initiatives going. How frustrating has that been for you?
Pretty frustrating, but also since my work or my initial education was in social work, and then working to understand long-range goals, understanding that even policy in itself doesn't happen overnight, I kind of had to take that in stride and did a lot of different things at the ARC over the years before I started seeing fruit. And really what kept me going was the stories. As a person who's survived quite a few things myself in my own life, when I would hear stories of people, whether or not we had the funding, it lights the fire in you to keep on it no matter what. And so that is really kind of what sustained me throughout this journey. And the more that I've talked to other people about this, it's kind of like we create our own little world of advocacy, and you see new people coming into the cause, and that's been really the most exciting part.
Was there one case in particular early on that really, really you thought, wow, this is really powerful work that we're doing?
That early on, when I first came to the ARC, that first year, I worked on a death penalty case here in Texas where I live. And I remember there was 6 different people involved in this case where someone had been murdered. And out of all of those individuals, everyone pointed the finger to one person, the one person that had intellectual disabilities. And we brought in experts, we flew in experts to explain to the jury what the situation was. And I was just sure that they would understand, knowing what I knew working at the ARC. And it did not make one difference. In fact, because the crime was so serious, I think it just did not allow anyone to see what had actually happened here and how there was one fall guy and everyone pointed the finger to that person. And when you realize how often that was happening throughout the country and other states, then but until you don't know. And I think that's been one of the biggest aha moments. Although Bob's early work focused on death penalty, I knew that this was so much bigger, and we had to have funding streams and ways to support this issue at every stage of the criminal justice process, that we couldn't just look at one piece of this. And that is really a big reason why we needed a national center to focus on it.
That's terrific. Now, last fall in your blog, I noticed that you said the Pathways program is taking a fresh look at its practices with disability, kind of with a disability justice lens. What prompted this?
Well, the need to focus on the intersection of disability and race, or disability and the LGBTQ community, that has been part of the center for many years. It was back in 2017 that we hosted a webinar to raise awareness of the systemic issues within systems that are dramatically impacting people of color or those who identify as LGBTQ, who also have disabilities. And in that, we were able to look at the different intersections that play into discrimination and violence towards people with IDD in the system. And we wanted to look at any innovative programs that were focusing on solutions. So that was before actually the George Floyd killing had taken place at the hands of law enforcement. And then so once that came, we were thinking, how do we ensure that people with disabilities are leading the conversation on these issues? And then COVID happened, and it's been kind of another different journey to figure out how to make sure that this is key to everything that we're doing here at the center. So we're also looking at not only bringing this key piece into our Pathways to Justice training, which we've had for a number of years now, but also how that can be in other trainings that we're a part of. And that has been a little challenging, I will say.
Like what?
Well, there's a training called CRIT, which is Crisis Response Intervention Training. And that has been a wonderful opportunity working with the Bureau of Justice Assistance funding to take what's traditional CIT training, which is crisis intervention training, and take that and really ensure that we have more information on IDD throughout. Typical police training will include more focus on mental health, or sometimes they may include autism, but they're not looking more comprehensively at IDD. And so this was an opportunity to do that. However, we weren't really able to bring in thinking about other identities of people with IDD into that conversation. So now we have this opportunity through the COPS office, which is also a part of the Department of Justice, to do an online training called Just Policing. And so we're taking this information around intersectionality as well as justice involved youth, because there are a lot of issues around juvenile justice and disability, and bringing that into both our pathways training as well as the Just Policing. So that Just Policing will be happening over the next 2 years.
And so who typically the training is for whom?
Law enforcement. That is the focus of the training. Now, that is for the Just Policing, because that will actually live on the COPS office portal. But for the Pathways training, it is more comprehensive than that. The Pathways includes not only law enforcement, but also legal professionals. So it could be attorneys, both sides, both prosecution as well as defense, and then also victim advocates. So we're wanting to bring in all the key players that could potentially interact with either a suspect, defendant, victim, also someone who's incarcerated, so that we're addressing this holistically, not just saying, if we just come in and do a training, we can check that box that you got that training. We know for a fact that training alone is never going to work. There has to be a more comprehensive kind of world around that training that we're building. And that includes creating a disability response team. And that team is made up of a local law enforcement officer, a victim advocate, an attorney, a person with a disability advocate at minimum. Typically, these teams are 15 to 20 people, and it could include probation and parole, someone from the corrections as well. So it can be as broad as the community wants it, but it's really a way to say, look, we're going to get in front of this issue. We choose to be proactive. We're not waiting for that crisis to happen. We're going to have a plan before these crises happen. And, when we do this police training, we'll often hear from law enforcement, okay, we hear you. We agree that we need training on this issue. We agree that we could respond differently. But where do people go? What if they do need help right here in this moment? Who do we call for that? And the reality has been there is a lack of services in our communities. And you can't sugarcoat that one. I mean, if we don't have places for people to get support, then where do they go? See, they end up cycling back into the criminal justice system.
So how are you going to get involved then in helping to build all of that? That sounds like a pretty big job in a lot of communities.
And that is the point of the disability response team. And so in some of the states, we've already seen folks pass legislation, for example, to try to really raise awareness around key issues that are impacting their community. We have a team in Virginia where they got real involved in needing to pass legislation around sex ed, so that people with disabilities could have access to that and know what is safe, what is not safe. We get many, many calls of people with IDD ending up on the sex offender registry, for example. And so it's key issues like that different communities are going to want to focus on. And that team of people can work together. When you're alone trying to address this, it's way too hard. It's way too overwhelming, honestly, and no community can do that. But when you start building those relationships with people in your own community, and you start seeing, that officer did care about that piece. That officer has a child with disabilities, and that judge really understood that piece of it. And then it starts its own synergy, because there are people that really do want to change things, but they just don't know how, and they're not connected.
Now, the ARC has also been working with individual families to promote awareness about people with IDD in the justice system. I know you've been working with quite a few families. Can you tell a couple of those stories of some of the work you've done with individuals?
Sure, and I believe this is the most important part of the work that this center does. So I appreciate the question. There's one family in particular that reached out to us a few years ago regarding their son who died actually while they were with him at the hands of law enforcement. And I remember working on their case and just how emotional it was and how difficult it was to see this family go through this. And it was just recently, before our last national convention in New Orleans back in November, that they reached back out to me because their lawsuit had been settled and they were now able to speak about it. And so they asked if I would meet with them. And I, of course, said yes. And I was emotionally preparing myself for this time to meet with them in person because I knew it was going to be really difficult. But they never dreamed that they would lose their 16-year-old son, and this is their only son, Eric, who has autism, the tragic way that they did just 4 years ago. They were doing a typical activity where they were out together. He was playing laser tag at a place in their community, and then when they were going to leave, their son, Eric, just kind of started having behaviors where he was not comfortable. He was feeling unsure of where he was, and he just started showing these behaviors that kind of concerned them. So police were called to the scene, and ended up, though, that he was basically put in a chokehold. And during this time, the whole time, the parents are there, seeing this happen. Ended up that he actually died right there. And what was really hard for this family is that it wasn't maybe 2 to 3 months before this that they had a situation where they called police, and it was great. And the officer did great. And there was no problem. The officer knew how to de-escalate, and there was no problem at all. So you can imagine now they're here, fast forward, and they're in this situation thinking that the same thing would happen. And so what that really alerts us to, and what we've been talking about together, is that there just isn't that consistency in response. And that's why the training is important, but that's not the only thing that's important. We have to think about much more than that. But training is one of those things that can help officers understand what exactly can go wrong and just how wrong it can go. And I'm talking about in minutes. This happened very quickly. And so we're doing everything we can to support this family because now they have their own healing. They are traumatized by this, and they don't want Eric to ever be forgotten. And we're looking for ways to make sure that his story is told, that, that this family really wants folks to understand that his life mattered and that his life continues to matter.
Now, after George Floyd, a number of communities around the country have started thinking about alternative policing methods. It's a much more common conversation today. How are those efforts going? Are different organizations being brought into some of those community conversations, and how's that going?
Yeah, we've seen that happening with some chapters throughout the country. And I'm glad you raised that, because one of the things that we had focused on is the new 988 number. So that number is there to direct, make a different direction rather than going to officers, that someone else is responding to that crisis, not a law enforcement response if it is not needed. And that is one avenue that we're trying to look to throughout the country to see where is IDD a part of that conversation. If it's not, why not? Because mostly it's not been. That number was more focused on calls around suicide, but it also talks about crisis response. And we know that this happens for people with IDD as well. So the reason I raise 988 is because when we think about different responses, community-based responses versus policing, peer-based responses, that's key. I think peer-based is really important.
What do you mean by that? And how does that turn up?
So basically, someone who's experienced this before, someone who wants to provide support, say, through a crisis, if someone's providing crisis response, how are peers, people who have experienced this, maybe people with lived experience, you would hear that term, or people with disabilities are a part of that process and able to really not just hear this from the professional side of you, but they're hearing it from a person who's lived through it and can really identify with someone that's just like them. And we've seen this happening, more in the mental health field. SAMHSA, the Substance Abuse Mental Health Services Administration, has been supporting peer-led activities for many years, peer-led training, et cetera. But we're really wanting to open that up more to the IDD field and see how we can create funding to pay people for their experience, their expertise, and their knowledge around this. So you can imagine what that could look like and how that could really change the conversation, hearing from people with disabilities in all of these different areas.
So is that already happening, or is that something you're working on?
We're working on.
Okay.
I like to plant seeds. It may not exactly be happening. I mean, it's happening in some ways outside of the criminal justice system, of course. For example, if someone is a victim of a crime and they are needing supports or services, you could have someone like a navigator come alongside. So we see some of that happening, but not enough, not to the extent that it could be. And again, that's another way of using funding, kind of pulling it away from looking at a criminal justice law enforcement response only and saying, well, if we put some money over here to really support peers to make these connections, to provide support, that could really be a game changer. We don't know until we try and we start putting some evaluation and research behind it and really, really know what strategies work best.
Oh, that sounds like a great idea. Any other updates to NCCJD or pathways? Anything we haven't talked about that you wanted to touch on?
Well, I think I mentioned a little bit, but we did recently celebrate a 10-year anniversary at the ARC's National Convention in New Orleans back in November, which was so exciting. And we will continue to do that throughout this coming year, just really trying to raise awareness of these issues to the level that we can gain the amount of funding and support needed to continue to do the work of the center. So I would really encourage anyone who's listening to contact us if they want to support this work in any way, whether it's sharing your story. Also, we have a national information and referral line. So we will help people with disabilities calling in, attorneys, police, anyone who wants to ask questions, get training. We're here for that as well.
And how do I access that? Is that a phone number? Is it a website?
Yes, we do have a website. If you go onto the ARC's website, which is thearc.org, you can look up criminal justice initiatives under there, and that will take you straight to our homepage.
Terrific. Oh, Leanna, it's just been wonderful to have this conversation with you. It's really great to kind of see the progress, and I know it can be frustratingly slow, but it does seem that things are starting to become a little more accessible to people, a little more within reach. As you sit here today and you think about, years after George Floyd, the funding that is starting to trickle in for some of these different initiatives, do you feel like we're on the cusp of some big changes, or are the numbers still kind of stacked against us?
Oh, wow. What a question. That is hard to say because you do see different possible legislation that could, tip the ball into our favor. 988, could that be a path to really draw funding to focus on this issue in a very different way so that we can build capacity in communities and not just focus on law enforcement response?
Within legislation, what would you say would be the critical piece that would really make a difference, do you think?
Well, I mean, if we could get 988 to really support people with IDD2 and it be more comprehensive, I think that would be a good start. But also really fully funding and supporting any kind of crisis intervention programs. How are we not addressing the deeper needs and the root causes of people's trauma, of why they're are where they are in life? How does disability play into that? How does race play into that? What about where they live, the socioeconomics of where they're at? I mean, we tend to want to focus on one answer, and it's really much more complicated than that. If we could look at different pieces of legislation and all of the disability community come together in looking at that, along with the law enforcement, the different kind of disability advocates and victim advocates, I think we would have a better chance overall.
I think you've really just described disability justice as a whole, and that's what our issue has been all about.
Reminds me of the term inclusive justice, which is one that we had brought out in some of our international work as we've looked at what are other countries doing in this space. You know, some are much farther ahead than us or doing things much better than us, at least trying to address, these issues. And
how are we different?
Well, we are part of the Access to Justice International Hub, and that has been going on for about 6 to 7 years now, and have traveled to the UK to have meetings there. The center has also been in Austria, and most recently last year, South Korea, who they were looking at wanting to create a national center on criminal justice and disability like what we have here in the US. And so different places are really on the continuum, right, of being just talking about it to really being more advanced than where we are. And examples of that would be in the UK, where they have what's called intermediaries that will actually be part of the court system, who can go into the court system and provide more communication support. So they're not really there as advocates, but more as anyone who needs support with communication. Obviously, that helps in the advocacy world, right? Because now they're being heard, seen, someone standing up for them to make sure that they have the communication needs met. There's, the question of what is actually doable here in our country, but there's also things like in Israel, where there's been some really good effort to train police officers, and that has seemed to really help, and officers have been open to learning about disability. So different things are going on, and I think it's important that we build solidarity around this issue internationally, because it can help us to understand where we are in the story. It helps us to understand where we are on the map when it comes to these issues, and we can really learn from each other.
Terrific. Oh, Leanne, it's just been wonderful to have this conversation with you. Thank you so much.
All right. Thank you, Janet. I appreciate it.
So great. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks for joining the conversation. If you'd like to reproduce all or part of this podcast, please email icipub@umn.edu.
Our show is co-produced at the University of Minnesota's Institute on Community Integration by Impact Managing Editor Janet Stewart and ICI Media Producer Pete McCauley. Skylar Mihailov is our editor. Graphic designers are Connie Burkhart and Sarah Kurtner. For more information on the Institute and all of our products and projects, please visit ici.umn.edu.